It's time to put on your overalls and straw hat, grab a pitchfork, and jump in the tractor. Today we're talking about farming. Not the get up at 5 o'clock to milk the cows kind of farming, but the consistently nurture your prospects along with advertising until they finally need what you sell and they automatically call you that kind of farming. My name is Rich Harshaw. I'm the founder and CEO of Level 10 Contractor. It's a marketing agency that specializes in generating 200 to 500 quotable leads every month for remodeling and home services contractors. You know, everyone has to hunt for leads when they're first starting out, but if you want to grow your business to a level 10 phenomenon, you have to plant roots. Today, I'm going to talk about how to determine the size of your farm and how to tell where to start farming. First thing that we want to know, how large is the market and how much would it cost to go all in, whole hog? What stations are available, both on radio and TV, and how much it's going to cost to be on each of those stations? Again, both on radio and TV, and then looking at that data and determining how much it's going to cost to be on radio and TV with a full buy on the stations that you want to be on. This is going to be an indicator of how big the farm is in your market. In other words, that's how much it's going to cost you to go out and buy everything that's available. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and buy everything that's available. You may never buy everything that's available in the marketplace that you're in. I've had plenty of clients that have had huge budgets that never come close to buying everything that was available because of budgetary constraints. And even though they had $2 or $3 or $4 million that they were spending, it still wasn't enough money to buy everything because they had very, very large farms. Again, if you're not following me, farms is going to be an analogy for the size of the stations in the budget that you're going to require. But here's at least what I want you to understand is the size of the farm. Each station in this farming analogy equates to a piece of land within the total farm. So what we want to do is figure out which pieces of land, which parcels out of this entire farm make sense for us to go and start with. Before we can see and evaluate the parts, we have to contemplate the whole to know what we're up against. Now, let me tell you how to do this. We're going to break it down into television and radio separately, and then we're going to look at them combined after we go through this exercise in a separate exercise. The market that I'm going to use for this example is going to be San Diego. The reason I'm going to use this as an example is because we recently did a buy in this market, and I've got all the data at my fingertips, and it's very topical for me. So let's start with TV. This is a client that we took over from a previous agency, so that the first thing that we did is look at the buy and see what they had been buying with those stations. Here's what we found. They were on ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC, and then also a local station called KUSI, and they were also on cable with a small amount of budget. So the first thing we want to do is go to the stations and say, hey, how much is it going to cost to have one spot per day on each of the news programs Monday through Thursday? Now, we could have a discussion about why not Friday? Why not weekends? But for our purposes, I just want you to know that we're going to go to the stations and say, give me your pricing to be on each news program that could start as early as 4:30 a.m. all the way through usually 10 or 11:30 news, okay? Monday through Thursday, one spot per day. Here's what they came back with again in San Diego. When we did that for NBC, we found that it would cost us $5,510 per day to be on each of those multiple news programs that air during the day, okay? Now that sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but you have to realize what you're getting for that money. We're going to be getting 498,000 impressions, right? That's a cost per thousand of $11.06. So let me very quickly point out, this is the original bid. This is the opening offer that this station gave us when we asked for pricing. And I'm going to show you in a minute how to estimate what we think it will actually be once we negotiate. I'll get to that in just a second. But first, let me share that Fox, for their one spot per news program per day, Monday through Thursday, they're going to charge us $2,600 per day to reach 201,000 people, which is a cost of $12.92 cost per thousand, CPM, right? The M is the Roman numeral, I think, for 1,000. It means melee or something like that. If you've heard me before, then you know that anything's up in the $10 plus CPM is not really something that we're all that interested in most cases, but it's a starting point. Again, I'm talking about linear TV, regular TV. I'm not talking about OTT or CTV as it's called, streaming television. We'll talk about that on a different podcast, okay? I'm trying to figure out how big the farm should be that we're looking at. I'm trying to figure this out. So let's move on to CBS. They were $2,475 to reach 301,000 people. Again, one per news program, one spot per news program per day, Monday through Thursday. This is just for one day. So that's a cost per thousand of $8.22. So it's a little bit better. ABC was $2,515 to reach 290,000 people, which is a cost per thousand of $8.67. The local station that I mentioned earlier, KUSI, their price was $1,245 to reach 126,000 people. All right. Now, so the obvious implication here is that this station doesn't have as big of an audience, but it's a good audience, and it's $9.85 CPM. So that's a little, I guess we'd call that middle of the road, okay? So for cable, we're focusing on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, primetime programs, and also the replays. In San Diego, that's 4 to 7 p.m. and repeat goes from 8 to 11. So they run one set of programming from 4 to 7, then they repeat it from 8 to 11, okay? So altogether, because of the large number of programs, these shows deliver 479,000 impressions on cable for $3,845, our second largest plot of land. Why? Because it's the second most money. Now, you might have heard me rail against cable before on the podcast, and you might be thinking, well, why would you even consider cable? Well, the reason I don't like cable is because usually it's a strategy designed to go in and buy small, certain, relatively small segments of a marketplace. So let's say, for instance, you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth media market, but you only service a small portion of the entire geography of that radio or TV footprint. So in other words, your service area, let's say hypothetically, is only something like 20% of the entire metropolitan area that's covered by radio and television. In that case, it's very inefficient to be on television. So people turn to cable and they say, well, I just want to buy this particular 20% of the market. The problem with that is you're not going to normally, yet it depends, you need to do your homework on this, but you're not normally going to get enough coverage in those couple of zones. You're going to fail on the law of numbers. You're just not going to be reaching enough people. But if you're talking about an entire metro area, which is the case of this situation for San Diego, it can compete very nicely against regular television, especially if you concentrate your buy on a few networks like I'm going to be talking about here. Also, let me just say this. With the advent of OTT over the last several years, this becoming mainstream, something that we're heavily leaning into, cable, as far as I'm concerned, is just freaking dead. There is absolutely no reason that I would want to buy cable, except for, again, in this case, we've got these specific programs that this client is interested in. They're going to buy it for the entire marketplace. So this is possibly an exception. So the first thing I want before I go to negotiate with these stations is I want to establish my planning number. This is like if you're going to go out and buy a car or a house. Let's say it's a house and you plan on spending, I don't know, $800,000 on a house. Well, that's your planning number. You might actually find a house that's $880,000 that you want to buy, or maybe you find a good deal and it's only, $720,000 or whatever. But the $800,000, it's a planning price. That number for me, in this case, looking at the data that we just collected, we're going to go with 30% less than what they're asking for. I'm going to go with that target. Okay. So a 30% discount. I'm just going to assume that I can negotiate 30% off the prices that I just went through a minute ago. Now, how did I come up with that number? Well, it's just based on experience. Here's what that does not mean. That does not mean that every time we go into any station anywhere in the whole country, we're going to automatically get specifically a 30% discount. Sometimes it's going to be much larger than a 30% discount. Sometimes it's going to be smaller than 30%, but on average, it's a good target. So here's what happens when we apply this 30% discounts to all those stations that I just mentioned. For one day, for all the spots, the total is $12,735. So here's what I just told you. I know there was a lot of numbers in there. Here's the most important one. If we were to go and buy all of these stations and negotiate successfully a 30% discount, and again, I've already given you the disclaimer that that's, it could be more or less, but here's the thing. It would cost us $12,735 to be on every single news program that I want to be on all 6 of those networks for one day. $12,735. Now, the CPM on that basis is going to come down from the average before was $9.59. Now it's going to come down 30% discount, $6.71. That's in range, okay? That's a price that I can probably live with, and I'm going to try to negotiate it lower, and I'll give you some tactics for getting it lower later, but here's what I want to know. To be on all of the stations, all of the news programs that I mentioned for one day, the number is $12,735. Now, let's do the math for multiple days of the week. Let's say 4 days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Okay, if you take that $12,735 cost per day and you multiply it by 4, then you get $50,940. Okay? In other words, it's going to cost $50,940 to have a full buy on all 6 stations 4 days a week. If you extrapolate that over the course of a year, and I'm using an annual buy, I'm going to use a placeholder of 46 weeks. That gives me a little bit of latitude to be off or on for a couple of weeks, whether it be 4th of July or Christmas, New Year's, whatever. Okay? It's arbitrary. You could be on 52 weeks if you wanted to be. It could be 42 if you wanted it to be. For my purposes, for our conversation, I'm going to use 4 days per week and I'm going to use 46 weeks per year. If we were to pay $50,940 per week for all 6 of those stations combined for 46 weeks, that would be $2,343,240. 2,343,240 for the entire year. Now, for that money, I'm going to be getting 348 million impressions, almost 349 million impressions. That's pretty good. But here's the interesting and relevant part of this discussion. What I can now see is that when it comes to the part of the farm that's called television, I can see that there's 6 pieces of land, and each of those pieces of land has a relative size. For instance, NBC is the largest piece of land on this farm. It's 30% of the farm. Fox, CBS, CBS, ABC, they're all 14% of the farm, give or take, and then Kusi is 7% of the farm. Now, cable, Cox, like we talked about earlier, is 21% of the farm. That's based on the planning numbers, okay? Remember, we took the numbers they gave us, we took 30% off for a planning figure, okay? Now, one thing I could do if I wanted to is reduce this number, and I could say, well, if I wanted to get the budget lower, I could say instead of 4 days per week, let's change this number to 3 days per week. That reduces the number per week from 50,940 to 38,199, and that reduces the 46-week annual to 1.75 million. I could also reduce the number of weeks from 46 down to say 42. So we'll take off some weeks, and that would reduce the size of my farm to something like 1.6 million. But again, for planning purposes, I want to look at the largest possible size of this farm. It's $2.3 million for TV. Now, look, I haven't even talked about radio yet. We haven't talked about OTT yet, but this is giving us an idea of how big the television side of the farm is. It's got 6 parcels, and those parcels together equal $50,940 per week and $2.4 million per year. Are you tracking with me on this? Now, let's put a bookmark in that for just a minute, and let's jump over to radio. On radio, we do it similarly, but there's a couple of key differences. First of all, I've gone in and evaluated all of the stations in the market that make sense demographically for my client to be on, and I've identified 7 stations. I've identified 2 news talk stations, a classic rock, 2 classic hits, which is oldies, and an adult contemporary station plus a country station. These all have demographics that make it worthwhile for me to take a closer look. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that when I start asking these stations for schedules, I'm not going to ask them like with TV for 1 spot per program for each of the news programs per day, because that doesn't make sense for radio. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them on a weekly basis, Monday through Thursday, how much will it cost me to get a 2.5 frequency? Now, we could have a whole discussion about frequency, what it is, how it works. I'm going to skip that for right now, and I'm just going to cut to the chase. Suffice it to say, frequency is how many times your ad plays for the same listener that they'll actually hear it, okay? So it's going to play maybe 25 or 30 times a week for them to hear it 2.5, which is our target frequency for each of those 7 stations. Okay, now for each of those 7 stations, I don't want to go through the individual prices per station, but let me just tell you this. It adds up for all of those stations for a week, $46,785. Now, you might remember a minute ago that 4 days per week on television was going to cost me $50,940, but I'm not finished because I haven't done the 30% discount thing on radio yet. That's the number I feel like we can negotiate with radio as well, and that's going to lower these prices from what I just said down to $32,750 for all of them combined. I know I'm throwing a bunch of numbers at you and it's going to be hard to follow, but I'm going to tell you something that would jump off page, which is massive. The CPM, the cost per thousand on all of these TV networks, remember it was $6.71 after the 30% discount. Again, remember, for planning purposes for radio, that number is $12.11, including CPMs as high as $19.85 and as high as $14.34. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, you gotta be flipping kidding me. That's a ton. That's a crap ton of money. $19.85 CPM on radio? Probably not worth it. But before we decide, let's look at the size of the total farm, because we've got 2 different parts of this farm now. We've got the radio part of the farm, we got the TV part of the farm. The TV part, based on annual basis, again, remember I said 40, I think it was 6 weeks per year, $2.3 million. The radio portion of this farm, on the other hand, it's going to be $1.5 million. If you add all that up, here's the total size of this farm, $3.8 million. Specifically, it's $3,849,740. Now, here's the huge problem. The client's budget is $1.25 million. So I've got to figure out how to buy as much of a $3.8 million farm as I possibly can with $1.25 million. And that's why we're having this conversation in the first place. I need to understand as a media buyer, what can I do with the budget that I have relative to what's available? Also keep in mind, OTT, digital advertising, is completely outside of this conversation. This is a linear TV and terrestrial radio conversation, okay? Now, also, I want to point out, like I said earlier, radio is massively inefficient. According to the numbers that I just gave you, 39% of the budget would go to radio in this farm, but only 26% of the gross impressions. That's because the cost per thousand is a lot higher on radio than it is on TV. By way of comparison, 61% of the budget goes to television in this farm, but it gives me 74% of the gross impressions. So automatically, without knowing anything other than looking at these numbers, I can see that TV is going to be a more efficient buy than radio on average. Now, important, that doesn't mean that every single piece of TV is more efficient than every single piece of radio, but on average, that's a pretty easy to draw conclusion. So here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to try to figure out, how do I get my budget to work in this farm that is so big? So what we're going to do is find the parcels of land that are the most efficient. All right, if you're tracking with me, I go I go back up to television and I say, okay, well, what are the CPMs on each of these individual stations or parcels of land, if you want to keep the analogy going? And here's what I find: 561, 689, 607, 576, 905, and 774. Did any of those numbers jump out at you? One of them jumped out at me big time. It was the biggest one. It was $9.05. Now remember, I haven't actually negotiated anything with any of these stations yet. These are all planning numbers. So that number, 905, that's for Fox. That CPM is not actual CPM that will actually come in. The Cox Cable CPM is $5.61, which is also not necessarily what will actually happen at the end of the day after we've negotiated. Again, remember, all of this is for planning purposes. So I can look at the total market and say, how big is this farm? Okay. And again, the number is $3.8 million for the entire farm. So the question now becomes, how do I skinny this down and actually get on these stations? Okay. Well, here's some things that you can do. First, I mentioned this earlier, you can cut the number of days per week from 4 to 3, and sometimes even down to 2. You can lower the number of weeks per year. I also mentioned that from 46, maybe you go down to, 42 or 36. Who knows? You can do it however you want. It's your media buy. Okay, I'm just giving you examples here. These are ways that you can make your budget fit into the farm. Another thing that you could do is go back to the stations and say, hey, for television, instead of 30-second spots, what if I bought 15-second spots? They're going to be cheaper, but usually not by half, usually by a factor of about 60, 65, 70%. Same thing on radio. You can cut your 60s down to 30s, but I really don't recommend this strategy of subbing 15s for 30s on TV and 30s for 60s on radio unless you've already been in the market for a long time on these stations and the audience already knows your brand. If they don't know your brand already, there's a lot of storytelling that we've got to do and we need the extra time. So it is a way to cut the budget, but it's not really an acceptable strategy to me, again, unless the client has been on these stations for a long, long time and the audience already has a certain amount of familiarity. The easiest solution though, if we're this far off, again, it's a $3.8 million farm with a $1.25 million budget, we're going to cut that fourth day off automatically. That's just going to go really, really quick. And then we're going to cut the least efficient programs. Okay. So for instance, let's just use ABC as an example. We came in here and we see that Good Morning America, which runs 7 to 9 a.m., let's see, on a 30-second spot basis has a CPM of 977. It's one of the highest CPMs. So what we'll do is we'll usually come in and cut the programs out that have the highest CPMs. We'll just throw them overboard. In this case, on ABC, we cut out Good Morning America. We also cut out the 6 p.m. news and the 11 p.m. news. The CPMs on the 6 p.m. news, $11.22. It's too high. The 11 o'clock news is $12.32. It's also too high. So we cut it out. We throw it overboard and we keep going from there. Another thing I can do for radio is I can cut the frequency down from a 2.5 maybe to a, 2.1, 2.2. I really don't want to go below 2.0. I can always shrink from 4 days to 3 days and shove that schedule into a little bit smaller spot. Another strategy that we use to get budgets down is what we'll call a heavy light schedule. Okay, a heavy light schedule means that we'll have some heavy weeks, which are full weeks like we just talked about, but then also sometimes we'll come in and we'll cut out maybe 50 or 60% of the spots for a given week. So we're running relatively fewer spots for relatively fewer dollars as a way to get the budget down. So for instance, in the San Diego buy, what we actually ended up doing is we went 36 heavy weeks and then we did 16 light weeks. Okay, so that's a total of 52 weeks, 36 heavy, 16 lights. And I believe the lights were something in the neighborhood of 40%. So when you start chopping that amount of dollars out, it gives you some coverage on the light weeks, but it actually saves you quite a bit of money over the course of the year. Okay, again, the idea of this exercise is simply to figure out how big is the farm that you're going after. Okay, now let me ask you this. What's the biggest challenge you're facing when it comes to figuring out your advertising budget and where to allocate it? Drop me a comment below. Let me know. I'd love to hear about your specific situations. The most important thing that you're normally going to do in these situations, especially when your budget is far smaller than the size of the farm, which is typical, is that we'll actually just either cut out radio or TV altogether. Sometimes we'll just cut out certain stations altogether. Look, here's the idea. You just look at your budget and you say, okay, we're going to buy what we can. And then later, as our budget grows over time in the coming years, we'll go back and buy the things that are less efficient. I mean, by the nature of the beast, we're going to buy the most efficient things first, and then we'll add on, as time wears on, the things that are less efficient and less efficient and less efficient. And at some point, you're going to get to a situation where you just don't ever add certain programs because they're just not ever efficient enough. I've done this lots of times in large markets. Some of the largest stations, their CPMs were so high, so out of line with the market because they could get it because their inventory was tighter because, we just ended up never going on those stations. But let me tell you what happened in this particular buy. We had $1.25 million to play with, and we ended up with a couple of different major strategies to cut the budget. First of all, we did go heavy on the shorter spots because, like I said, this client has been on these stations for a lot of years, so they do have good brand awareness. So if we lower the length of the spots, we can still have a pretty creative campaign because we don't have to be quite as much into storytelling mode all the time because people know who this client is. I think what we ended up doing is we ran a ratio on TV of 3 short spots. I think what we ended up doing is a ratio ratio of 50-50. So 50% short spots, 50% longer spots. That actually saved us quite a bit of money, and that allowed us to get these budgets down quite a bit. We also chopped out some of the least efficient programs. So instead of being on 10 or 11 or 12 or how many ever newscasts on a given station during a day, maybe we're only on 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 11 or 4 out of 10 or whatever the thing is, okay? So that's one of the things that we did. We also implemented a heavy light schedule like I talked about a second ago, okay? All of this worked out really, really well. We were able to negotiate the CPMs down to, let's see here, looks like television came in at $3.42, which is a pretty massive decrease. But again, remember, we took some pretty drastic measures. We cut the spots down to where half of them were shorter. So that's going to lower the CPM quite a bit. We also ended up spending on TV in this market, I think it was $1.13 million. We ended up getting 386 million gross impressions at a CPM of $3.42. On radio, we ended up negotiating with one of the radio networks and did an exclusive with them. And we were able to negotiate CPMs in the range of $6.42 or $5.88, depending on if it was a heavy or light week. So we ended up spending $276,000 on radio and the total spend of $1.4 million. That's where we came in on this buy. We bought up all 6 TV stations and we ended up buying 3 of the 7 radio stations. So we were able to actually pack a significant punch with this $1.4 million gross budget. So if it's a $3.8 million gross max buy, we were able to come in and get what I consider to be a very robust, strong buy for $1.4 million. We're able to remain on all of the TV stations. Now, this conversation isn't really about what happened in this market. It's about helping you to understand and determine what the size of the market of the farm is and how to determine how to get that number down to fit your budget and also where to start. So hopefully that's been helpful for you. I know it's a big conversation. There's been a lot of numbers, but hopefully you found something that was useful there. So if you're looking for marketing that works, no fluff, 200 to 500 leads a month, that's what we do here at Level 10 Contractor. We build systems that deliver. Click the links and you can get started with us. If you found this valuable, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and you won't miss any future podcasts. Click on the little bell icon that'll get you notified of our next video, and I'll see you then.